So is the war in West Asia back on? Because it seems like we should be holding our breath again. We talked about a ceasefire. We watched JD Vance and the Iranians fly into Islamabad and then fly out of Islamabad. And now Trump is back to threatening Iran. And this time he's threatening to blockade of Hormuz and Iranian ports. So we're going to figure out what this really means now that those talks have failed. Are they likely to talk again? What is going to happen from here, especially for all of us who are watching this really closely, because if that Strait of Hormuz is completely blocked by the American Navy, then oil prices will shoot up and it's literally going to starve citizens across the world, people who have absolutely nothing to do with what is going on between these three countries. So before we get started, I'd ask you again to please like this video, share it, subscribe to our channel, and if you can, sign up for our membership. Remember, for our members, we put out a news bulletin every night, which is curated, fact-checked, and presented in the most calm manner possible. It's 10 minutes of your time where you will get all of the important news from around the world in a way that doesn't irritate you. Okay, so sign up for our membership, tell friends and family also about it. It will be very helpful if you do. Let's get started with what has happened over this weekend. So on Friday, you'll remember, there was uncertainty about whether or not the talks would happen at all. On the next day, both sides that had flown in met Pakistani representatives separately. Then they sat down face to face, and for 21 hours there were discussions, and then there was no deal. Early Sunday morning in Pakistan, the Iranian foreign spokesperson said that the talks were intensive, but Washington had excessive demands and unlawful requests. US Vice President JD Vance, who was leading the talks on that side, basically said that he said at a press conference that the US had made its red lines very clear and Iran had not agreed to those terms. Vance left Pakistan and the US began posting statements about the Navy possibly blockading Iranian ports. Now, this is what Vance also said about the possibility of more talks, right? So he blamed the failure of the negotiations on Iran's refusal to abandon its nuclear weapons program. Iranian delegates claimed that Washington needs to do more to win their trust. Now, Vance basically said he spoke to Donald Trump half a dozen times during this entire conversation, and they were clear about Iran's nuclear program. And Vance added that while there was a failure to reach an agreement in Islamabad, that was bad news. It was bad news for Iran, much more than it was bad news for the United States of America. Iran, on the other hand, blamed the US for the failure of the talks. Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who led Iran's negotiation, basically said that Iran offered constructive initiatives, but the US was unable to gain their trust. And he said it's now up to Washington to decide what it can do to gain their trust. He also said, naturally, we're not expecting to reach an agreement in this single session. So there's a suggestion from Iran that there may be more rounds of negotiation, but we've not heard that from the US, that the US is open to more rounds of negotiation. So we don't really know where both of those sides stand at this point. Here's another angle, though, and this is a piece of information that I feel like I should give you. So when the Iranian delegation arrived on Friday in Pakistan, they were all dressed in black, in mourning for their late supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and the others who died in the war. And on the flight that came in, on each seat, they had placed shoes and bags covered in blood of the children and photographs of the children who died in the school bombing in that military compound. In response, the Pentagon had said that that strike on that military compound is under investigation, although in a sidestep, Reuters has reported that the investigation shows that it's pretty clear that the US was responsible for it. And not only was it responsible for that hit, it was also a double tap, which means you hit it, you wait 40 minutes for the first responders, so the fire service, the cops, anyone who's helping ambulances to arrive, you hit it again, and this time the first responders die as well. So this is what happened, and according to Reuters, it was pretty clear that the US was responsible. Now, what has Donald Trump said about the failure of the talks? And this is important. Trump has basically said the United States Navy is going to begin blockading the Strait of Hormuz immediately. He also said, he accused Iran of extortion and said that the US Navy would hunt down and basically interdict ships in international waters that have paid Iran a toll to pass through the strait. He said US forces will begin clearing mines. Effectively, US Navy, the finest in the world, will begin the process of blockading any or all ships that enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz, he said. Donald Trump said they basically said that they will block impartially vessels leaving Iranian ports, including at the Strait of Hormuz. And this is where, the question really comes up as to what this means. Is Donald Trump effectively trying to stop the oil from reaching the countries who were getting it up till now? Remember, China has been receiving oil. Russia is a main trader of Iran. So he wants to bring his allies who did not come to his support and other countries who are neutral into this battle as well. So is he planning on stopping oil for everybody? And what does that mean for the world? Now, on expected lines, Iran has threatened ports in the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. So we're back again to talking about what happens in the UAE and the Gulf countries. Security in Persian and the Sea of Oman is either for everyone or for no one at all. This is what the Islamic Republic Broadcasting has said so far. No port in the region will be safe if you block our ports. So there's also a report that says Iran is keeping about 21 million barrels of oil floating in storage on ships right now, maybe trying to keep its ports safe. So this is everything that has happened since we last spoke. The question to ask right now is, if America is threatening this blockade, is the blockade legal from international law? I mean, does Donald Trump really care about international law? But is it legal or illegal? Let's examine that point to begin with. Now, a blockade is when a country uses its military or its navy to stop ships from entering or leaving a certain area. If the US does this in the Strait of Hormuz, it's not just a policy move, it's a military act, and in international law, it has consequences. So the blockade would actually mean war. It would mean basically the ceasefire is over and hostilities have resumed, and blockades are governed by the law of naval warfare. It is not a peacetime law. So that's the first thing to understand. What is the blockade? When the Navy comes in and basically blocks an entire port. And they only do that in the case of war, which means that we are no longer in a ceasefire. What about Iran's actions? What Iran has been doing up till now, we could argue, hey, but Iran's been blockading ships. It's been restricting ships. It's been escorting some vehicles through. And it's been possibly charging tolls as well. Under normal circumstances, this would violate international law. But in a conflict, it can be argued that Iran is acting as a belligerent in an ongoing armed conflict and trying to control a strategic war zone. So that brings us to a sidestep education moment. What is a belligerent in a war? So in any war, there are two types of players. There are the belligerents and there are the neutrals. Now, what does this mean? A belligerent in a war is a country that is actively currently fighting. In this case, Iran, the United States, and Israel. These are the only three belligerents in this war. They are actively using military force. They're directly engaged in the conflict. Remember, the Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia were actually intercepting, but they never directly used military force. So they're not belligerents. So that is what. And under international law, belligerents can impose blockades or they can actually control war zones. Now, what is a neutral? A neutral is a country that's staying out of the war. That has nothing to do with it. So India, for example, in this case is a neutral, or China is a neutral in this. They don't take military sides. Their ships should be allowed safe passage and they're protected under international law. So now let's circle back. Is the US blockade legal? The answer is yes, but only within limits. The US is a belligerent in this conflict, so it can legally impose a blockade, but there are very crucial rules that the blockade needs to follow. One, it cannot starve civilians. Now, if you stop the oil going to the rest of the world, you will actively, especially in India, be starving regular people who have nothing to do with your war. You must declare and enforce consistently, and it must not unfairly target neutral countries. These are the laws when it comes to basically blockades. The real problem here is the Strait of Hormuz. Now, if the Strait of Hormuz is closed completely by Donald Trump, which means that he doesn't allow any ships to go through at all, which means no one will get their oil. 20% of that oil will be frozen, including for countries like China. And so then what happens? The oil prices shoot through. Regular people cannot afford fuel, they cannot afford food, everything becomes more expensive. You start starving the poorest in the world. Billionaires have a tendency to not care about the poorest in the world, but that is what will begin to happen. So global oil supply will start to choke. Fuel prices will go up. Economies around the world, starting from the poorest, will start to suffer. So these are the scenarios that we're looking at right now that could play out. The US could do a full blockade of the strait. It could risk then conflict with neutral countries. So people who are staying out of it right now, say all of Europe, UK saying this is not our problem, Australia saying this is not our problem, they will actually start to go into conflict with these countries. It disrupts global trade and it could trigger a major escalation. The second one, the US limits itself only to Iranian ports. That's a more traditional wartime strategy, perhaps more likely. Other ships could pass through, neutral ships could pass through, but except that they are targeting their enemy at this point. Legally, it is cleaner and less explosive. But it's also fundamentally about a show of military strength and a negotiating tactic. If Iran cannot export oil, its economy starts to take a direct hit. So here's the irony. Traditionally, as a democracy, the United States has historically defended the freedom of navigation in the oceans of the world. The idea that ships should be allowed to move freely through global waters. So this blockade actually, it's now contradicting its own principles based on what that country believes in. So we ask if the blockade will really happen, how far will US go, and that's something we're going to be watching closely. Of course, it will have far-reaching effects on countries like China. China is one of the leading trade partners for Iran, and China has sort of stayed out of it, but we understand from the story that we put out earlier that Pakistan had to call Beijing. Beijing had to nudge Iran to finally sit down at the table with the US for that ceasefire. So Beijing, we know, clearly is not interested in this war going on any further. They want to wrap it up. They want to go back to business as usual. So they're not going to like this at all. Oil prices will rise through the market. Brent crude has already gone up about 7% today. If it stays above $100, this is not something that Donald Trump can explain to his domestic audience either. Now, how has Iran responded? And this is really interesting. Iran has basically said, hey, you fight, we'll fight. If you come forward with logic, we will deal with you with logic. So this is the statement that's come from them. President Masoud Pezeshkian, in a call with Vladimir Putin, apparently said that Tehran is asking for a balanced and fair agreement. If the United States returns to the framework of international law, reaching the agreement will not be far off. The question is, what happens next? Pakistan, who's played the peacemaker so far, has basically said that they remain optimistic. Pakistan's foreign minister has said it's imperative that the parties continue to uphold their ceasefire and we will continue to facilitate new dialogue. So let me take you through the possible outcomes from here, from what we know so far. One, controlled tension, not a full war, right? So this is possibly what will happen, where US and Iran keep pushing each other, where they are avoiding a full-scale war, but they stay tense, they stay on alert. The ceasefire technically holds, but it's just we're all holding our breath. And that would look like sporadic strikes here and there. It would look like Israel and Hezbollah going at it some more. Not great news for the people in Lebanon. Continued pressure over Strait of Hormuz, threats, sanctions, military posturing. Nobody, like I said, can afford, among these people can afford a law. Donald Trump cannot sell this to his people right now. They are done with this war. Iran cannot afford a war anymore. Israel is the only one who kind of enjoys the idea. The rest of the world cannot afford for this to go on either. Everybody wants it to stop. The second, and we've had this conversation in the past, is the possibility of a miscalculation leading to a sudden escalation. This is what happens. When countries stay at heightened states of tension for a long time, somebody lower in the rung makes a mistake. A US ship gets hit. Iran misreads a military move. Israel launches a bigger strike than it expected. The two are not talking to each other clearly. Someone makes a mistake. The ceasefire collapses. US will respond directly. And then you will have a regional conflict, which will involve the Gulf. It will involve Lebanon. It will involve Iraq, Syria. Again, nobody wants that, but this is technically how wars start, because that heightened sort of tension state should not stay for too long. The third possible option is economic. So bombs are not flying, but oil prices, shipping disruption, insurance costs are skyrocketing. The US is tightening sanctions pressure, possible blockade of Iranian oil. All of these things could also happen. The fourth option, and this would possibly be something the whole world wants at this point, a diplomatic solution. If Islamabad, if talks, have failed in Islamabad, the second round of talks, maybe somewhere else, or by, nudging by China and other regional players, back-channel negotiations, buy more time, avoid escalation. There is a fair understanding across the world right now that a full regional war, where US and Iran go at each other directly, Hezbollah gets involved, the Strait of Hormuz is closed completely, seems highly unlikely. It doesn't seem like something anybody wants on the table right now. Everybody wants an ramp out of this, and that's what we should be heading for. So at this point, we should be watching the headlines for Strait of Hormuz. Is it being closed completely? How many ships are being allowed through on a daily basis? The US military build up, what they call boots on the ground. Now they're talking about the Navy moving in. So how many American soldiers are being moved into that area, being put at harm's way? Because the closer you get to Iran's waters, there was one, Iranian embassies across the world have developed a sense of humor in all of this, and one of them said, and when Donald Trump said we're going to close the Strait of Hormuz, one of them said, hey, you're going to have to move your Navy a little closer to do that. We're waiting. So obviously, the closer the American soldiers move into that space, the more risk they're taking. And is Donald Trump willing to take that risk? We'll have to keep an eye on Israel, because there are, again, many analysts who believe that Benjamin Netanyahu is not a guy to go for peace right now, because domestically it puts him at risk of losing his seat. For as long as that country is at war, one way or the other, he gets to stay in power, and that's possibly what he's trying to do. So we have to keep a close eye on Israel to see what the various things that Israel might do to disrupt the ceasefire and make things go south in order for Benjamin Netanyahu to stay in power. And finally, we keep an eye on oil prices, because at the end of the day, Donald Trump can get away with many things, but I don't think he can get away with high fuel prices in the US. He promised that fuel prices be $2 at one point per gallon, which they call a gasoline at $2 a gallon, but it's currently close to $4 a gallon. It's not nice. People don't like it. Americans dislike that sort of thing. And he's the biggest voices that supported him domestically, like look at Tucker Carlson, regularly sharply criticizing what Donald Trump is doing. He recently called the Iran war the gravest mistake made by any American president in its history. So really strong language. Megyn Kelly, former Fox News, used to be a huge supporter of Donald Trump, is also questioning the language that is being used, the manner in which this diplomacy is happening, and the risk that America is taking for a war that is not theirs. So all of the sides are being squeezed on various points. The world cannot afford it. We want this to be wrapped up as quickly as possible. The question is, can America just shut it down without looking for at least, it's looking for a way to make themselves feel like they won something. Once one of my friends said, can someone just give him a trophy and make him feel happy so he backs down? And maybe that's where we are right now. But these are the various things currently in motion, and hopefully we'll have some sort of clarity. As we look at the clock right now, it's just about time for him to wake up and give us his morning expletives on social media. So we'll keep an eye on it for you and bring you the information as and when it does come in. He's having a very interesting spat with the Pope, of all of the people. I didn't include it in this story because it would just complicate all of the information I was trying to give you. But normally the papacy, doesn't take names and stays completely neutral. For the first time in the history of the Vatican, we have an American Pope who has really taken on Donald Trump. It's very interesting. It's interesting, politically, because America has such a large Christian population, not necessarily Catholic population, but Christian population. And Trump criticizing the Pope in this manner, I wonder how far that will take him, because the Pope has come out and various apparently bishops and cardinals, powerful bishops and cardinals within the US have come out to say that the idea of Christian values are being misused to push this war, and this war is not a war that God supports. If you ask me, personally, and I never give out my opinion, I'm always wary of religious people who believe to know what God is thinking, because nobody knows what God is thinking, if at all that is the case. But I just think that politically, if you look at it purely politically, it's a really interesting stance that Donald Trump is taking. He's alienating a lot of his supporters. Remember, Republican supporters are deeply religious. They might not all be Catholic, a lot of them are Christian, but they're deeply religious. And so to have religious voices from within the country saying, hey, dude, this is not God's war, stop painting it as God's war, will also form a dent in his, in his levels of popularity within his country. Lots of things for Donald Trump to think about as he wakes up on this Monday morning. I'll leave you there. Leave me a comment in the comment section on how you think this is going to play out and what you think the outcome is likely to be.